We caught up with the Israelites as they're continuing their escape from captivity under Egypt, and it's because of this experience of being captives and being slaves in another land that so often they are told by God to care for those who are strangers and aliens in their land. Hospitality runs throughout the Hebrew Scriptures, and it's often closely connected to harvest. The Israelites are told later on that the edges of their fields are to remain unharvested so that the widows and the orphans and the aliens resident in their land have something to eat. And that was a big ask. We imagine, through the evidence that we have of archaeology, that perhaps those people living in first century Palestine spent 90% of their waking hours, that is everyone except for, of course, the soldiers, a very tiny proportion of the rich people and the priests who got away without doing this, but everyone else spent about 90% of their waking hours either cultivating or preparing food. It was a constant battle to make sure that there was enough harvest to keep everybody fed. We, as city dwellers, understand the reality of harvest less and less. We're separated from the means of production, and harvest can fade both in our imagination and understanding, or we can glorify it into some sort of 19th century British idealism, and neither of those are probably an excellent way for us to celebrate harvest. What we are still familiar with, though, is hospitality, and through hospitality we can access some of what ought to be our proper harvest celebration. And Jesus gives a good deal of guidance in the giving and also the receiving of hospitality in the gospel that we heard today. Firstly, we can imagine ourselves in the shoes of Jesus' disciples, those who were being, in the reading we heard, sent out into the mission field, where Jesus, of course, tells them that the harvest is plenty. And his advice is that they are to rely on the hospitality of others. He says, provide neither gold nor silver, nor brass in your purses, no scrip for your journey, neither 2 coats, neither shoes, nor yet staves. Now, this may, on the surface of it, sound like a contravention of that Boy Scout maxim that prior planning and preparation prevent poor performance. And my scoutmaster back home, he thought that no harm could befall a boy who had in his pocket a spare set of shoelaces. But this is not an attempt at teaching these people to be unprepared or to be slapdash. Instead, it's meant to be about a balance of power. If you take nothing with you, then you place yourself at the mercy of others. No longer are you arriving as the powerful outsider, but you're arriving instead as the needy guest. For many of us, this can be quite hard. When I first entered into ministry, I arrived at a church down in Hadley, and all of the older women there wanted to make me cups of tea all the time. And I felt like this was something that I needed to say no to. Firstly, because I didn't want to sort of perpetuate the looked after vicar and the women of the parish doing all of the work. And also I felt uncomfortable so soon as I'd arrived being elevated to this position of power in which I was never the one who made the tea or coffee or did the washing up, and I was always the one who received that kindness. Well, I went to speak to my spiritual director about it, and he said to me, well, it's just as important, he said, to be a grateful receiver of this kind of hospitality and to allow others to offer it, as it is to offer it yourself. You should be more gracious in your receiving of it. So I had this set in my head. The next weekend, I was away from the parish, it turned out. I was off playing a game of rugby back at my old college, and I met there with a friend, and after the game we went to a pub, and we ordered a burger and a beer, and I said, I'll get this, Ollie. And my friend Ollie said to me, oh, no, don't worry, I'll get it. And I said, oh, okay, thanks, that would be lovely, thinking that I'd carried out my spiritual director's advice. Ollie said, oh, gosh, that was a bit quick. And I thought, well, there's no winning either way, is there, on offering the hospitality or receiving it. But the point is to make ourselves vulnerable to that kind of experience of being the one who lays oneself at the mercy of another and receives hospitality from them. The point is this, that rather than thinking that I don't ever want to be in that situation where I owe anyone else anything, I want to be completely independent, standing on my own 2 feet. Instead, we are to recognize our mutual need. And the best way of doing that is truly throwing ourselves onto the mercy of others. What Jesus is telling those who work in his name, and FYI, that's all of you, is this, and I paraphrase, you're going to have to rely on the kindness. In some places you'll be received, in some places you won't. But wherever you go, speak peace, eat what is set before you, and God near. And as those who are sent out, me and you, there is a great amount of relief in that second point, that in some places you'll be received and in some you won't. It is your job to invite people to church and to share your faith with them. There's no getting around that one. I don't want to hear any of this, oh, well, my faith is for me a very private and personal thing. It's not the sort of thing I want to talk to with others about. That's rot. Faith is for sharing. It's just like when I read a great book or watch a good movie. The next day I want to say to people, I saw something brilliant last night on television. I really recommend that you watch it too. So too, we should be saying to those who we meet, I had a wonderful experience of worshipping God on Sunday in church. I really recommend you to come and try it too. So too, it's imperative that we share our faith with those that we meet. What's more, the number one reason that people become Christians, the surveys tell us, is simply because somebody invited them along to church. That was all that it took. You just have to tell people you're going and would they like to come along. For those of you who feel overwhelmed by that, the good news is that's the point at which your work is done. If they welcome your offer, all well and good, and if they reject it, then you may brush the dust off your feet. Your work there is done. You can move on with a clear conscience. That's about receiving hospitality, but what about offering it? Well, the first thing to highlight are these words of Jesus. Freely you have received, freely give. There is a grave heresy that we are especially susceptible to as those living in this modern capitalistic society in which we find ourselves, and it can be summed up like this. I deserve what I have, and therefore it is mine to do with as I choose. I deserve what I have, and therefore it is mine to do with as I choose. This kind of wrong thinking flies in the face of what we know about the grace of God. We live not because we deserve to, but by God's will. We are forgiven not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, but simply because in God's great love for us, it is what God chooses to do. We receive the bounty of creation, not because we deserve it, not because we've earned it, but because it is God's good grace to us. All good gifts come from God, and to God they belong. They're simply lent to us, and so we should seek to use them in God's ways. And to make this really clear, Jesus tells his disciples what waits in store for those who fail to offer hospitality. He says, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for those who withhold hospitality. And that's because that was the sin of those nations. You remember when the angels arrive at Lot's house and the people of Sodom and Gomorrah come round offering not hospitality, but instead violence. Ezekiel puts it this way. He says, "Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed and unconcerned. They did not help the poor and the needy." We, for whom harvest can be something so dissociated from our urban lives, can take it seriously by taking hospitality seriously, allowing ourselves to be vulnerable in accepting hospitality from others and offering hospitality to those in need, remembering that our successes are not the result of our brilliance, but the generous gift of God that we are called upon to share. Amen.